Billionaire mocked his assistant's looks, until he saw her at the pool and went wild with jealousy. She knew the comment wasn't meant for her ears, but she heard it anyway. The glass conference room on the 32nd floor of TechVision Corp buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy. Outside, Seattle's skyline stretched endlessly under a blanket of gray clouds, while inside, the corporate machine hummed with calculated precision. Vivian Mitchell adjusted her navy blazer and checked her watch. 8:47 a.m. 3 minutes before the quarterly review meeting would begin. She had prepared every document, cross-referenced every statistic, and anticipated every possible question Blake Harrison might throw at the room. At 28, she had turned efficiency into an art form. Her auburn hair was pulled back in its usual neat chignon, not a strand out of place. The muted taupe blouse beneath her blazer was pressed to perfection, her black slacks conservative yet professional. Everything about her appearance whispered competence while refusing to demand attention. In a world where image often trumped substance, Vivian had learned to let her work speak first. She slipped into the conference room quietly, placing the bound reports at each seat with practiced precision. The familiar weight of her responsibilities settled on her shoulders like a well-worn coat. As the senior executive assistant to the CEO, she had orchestrated hundreds of these meetings, each one a carefully choreographed dance of corporate ambition and strategic maneuvering. "Good morning, Vivian." The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, the CFO, who always arrived early and always remembered her name. Unlike some people. "Good morning, Mr. Webb. The quarterly reports are at your seat along with the revised projections from the Northwest Division." He nodded appreciatively. "You always think 3 steps ahead. Blake's lucky to have you keeping him organized." Before she could respond, the conference room door swung open with unnecessary force. Blake Harrison entered like a storm front. Expensive charcoal suit perfectly tailored, dark hair styled with casual precision, and that particular brand of confidence that came from never having to question your place in the world. At 35, he commanded TechVision Corp with the kind of ruthless efficiency that had tripled their market share in 5 years. He was brilliant. She'd give him that. But brilliance, Vivian had learned, didn't automatically come with kindness. "Morning, everyone." Blake's voice carried that familiar edge of impatience, as if the day was already moving too slowly for his liking. His steel blue eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and calculating alliances with the speed of a supercomputer. Vivian busied herself with her tablet, pulling up the presentation slides and checking the audio system one final time. She had long ago perfected the art of being present but invisible, close enough to anticipate needs, distant enough to avoid unnecessary interaction. The meeting commenced with its usual rhythm of PowerPoint slides and profit margins. Blake held court at the head of the polished oak table, his presence filling the space like expensive cologne. He questioned strategies, challenged assumptions, and dissected quarterly performance with surgical precision. Vivian took notes on her tablet, tracking action items and follow-up requirements with methodical attention to detail. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in Blake's expression, the slight tightening around his eyes when numbers disappointed him, the way his fingers drummed against the table when presentations ran too long. "The Denver expansion is behind schedule," announced Janet Torres, the VP of Operations, her voice carrying a note of defensive concern. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Behind by how much?" 3 weeks, possibly 4. "The permit delays have been—" "Excuses don't accelerate timelines, Janet." Blake's interruption was swift and cutting. "I need solutions, not explanations." Vivian glanced up from her tablet, catching the brief flash of frustration that crossed Janet's face. She made a mental note to follow up privately with operations later. Sometimes a gentle reminder email could smooth over the rough edges Blake left in his wake. As the meeting dragged toward its second hour, Blake's attention seemed to wander. His gaze drifted around the room, settling briefly on each face before moving on. When his eyes reached Vivian, they passed over her with the same attention he might give a piece of office furniture. Functional, necessary, but utterly unremarkable. It was then, as Janet struggled through another explanation about supply chain delays, that Blake leaned slightly toward David Holloway, the head of marketing. The 2 men sat close enough that their voices, lowered to what they surely thought was a private whisper, still carried to Vivian's corner of the room. "At least Janet tries," Blake murmured, his tone carrying that particular brand of casual cruelty that came so easily to him. "Unlike some people who just blend into the wallpaper," David chuckled softly, glancing in Vivian's direction before looking away. "Efficiency over aesthetics, I suppose." Blake's response was barely audible, but in the acoustic perfection of the glass conference room, every word reached her with crystalline clarity. Some people are meant to be invisible. Makes everyone else's job easier. The words hit Vivian like ice water in her veins. Her fingers tightened around her tablet, but her expression remained perfectly neutral. Years of practice had taught her to absorb such moments without flinching, to process the hurt later in private, where weakness couldn't be weaponized against her. She continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. Her handwriting as steady and precise as always, but something fundamental had shifted in that moment. A crack in the professional armor she wore like a second skin. The meeting concluded 20 minutes later with the usual distribution of assignments and deadlines. As the executives filed out, making plans for lunch and discussing weekend golf games, Vivian remained behind to collect the scattered papers and reset the room for the afternoon session. Blake paused at the door, not looking back. "Vivian, I'll need the Morrison contract revisions by 3, and schedule the board dinner for Thursday, somewhere with better lighting than last time." "Of course, Mr. Harrison." He left without another word, already pulling his phone from his pocket and diving into the next crisis that demanded his attention. Alone in the empty conference room, Vivian allowed herself one moment of stillness. She looked out at Seattle's skyline, at the city where she had built her career one meticulous detail at a time, and wondered when professionalism had become indistinguishable from invisibility. But then she straightened her shoulders, gathered the last of the documents, and walked back to her desk. She had contracts to revise and dinners to arrange. The work, at least, had never failed to see her value, even if no one else did. The silence between them had become a language of its own. 3 weeks had passed since the conference room incident, and Vivian had perfected the art of professional detachment. Her responses to Blake's requests had become surgical in their precision. No unnecessary words, no lingering eye contact, no trace of the warmth that had once softened their working relationship. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said as he strode past her desk at 7:43 a.m., his usual 17 minutes early. Her tone was perfectly neutral, like a GPS navigation system announcing the next turn. Blake paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something flickered across his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or the faint recognition that something had shifted in their usual routine. But he said nothing, disappearing into his corner office behind walls of frosted glass. Vivian returned to her screen, fingers dancing across the keyboard as she organized his calendar with mechanical efficiency. Board meeting at 9, lunch with investors at noon, conference call with the Tokyo office at 4. Each appointment was a small fortress of corporate necessity, protecting her from having to think about the growing hollowness in her chest. Her phone buzzed. A text from her college roommate, Melody, now living in Portland with 2 kids and a golden retriever named Einstein. "Coffee tonight? You sound stressed in your emails lately." Vivian stared at the message. When had her professional email started betraying her emotional state? She prided herself on compartmentalization, on keeping her personal feelings sealed away like classified documents. "Rain check? Big week at work," she typed back, then immediately deleted it. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She wasn't sure she could sit across from her best friend and pretend everything was fine. "Maybe next week. Things are crazy here." The response felt like swallowing glass, but it was easier than explaining why she felt like she was disappearing. One ignored glance at a time. "Vivian." Blake's voice cut through her thoughts like a scalpel. He stood in his doorway, jacket already on, briefcase in hand. "I need the Patterson file before I leave for lunch, and call Morrison. Tell him I want those projections revised. The numbers don't add up." "The Patterson file is already on your desk, second drawer, tabbed section C," she replied without looking up. "And Mr. Morrison submitted the revised projections yesterday afternoon. They're in your email, marked priority." Blake blinked, clearly caught off guard by her efficiency. There was a time when such moments would have earned her a grudging nod of approval, maybe even a rare, "good work." Now, he simply adjusted his tie and headed for the elevator. But he stopped, turned back. "Is everything—" He trailed off as if the question itself was foreign territory. "You seem different lately." The observation hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Vivian finally looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time in weeks. His steel blue eyes held something she couldn't quite identify. Uncertainty, maybe, or the beginning of awareness. "Different how, Mr. Harrison?" The formal address hit its mark. She saw him flinch almost imperceptibly, the same way someone might react to an unexpected slap. "Never mind," he said quickly. "It's nothing." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Vivian allowed herself a moment of dark satisfaction. For once, Blake Harrison seemed unsure of himself. For once, he was the one left wondering what had changed. The afternoon brought its usual parade of phone calls and emails. She coordinated with department heads, scheduled conference rooms, and managed the endless stream of details that kept TechVision Corp running smoothly. But every task felt mechanical, like she was operating on autopilot, while her real self watched from somewhere far away. At 4:15, her desk phone rang. Vivian Mitchell, Mr. Harrison's office. Ms. Mitchell, this is Gregory Thorne from Blackstone Industries. I'm calling about the quarterly partnership review scheduled for tomorrow. She pulled up Blake's calendar, cross-referencing meeting details with practiced ease. Yes, Mr. Thorne. The meeting is scheduled for 2 p.m. in conference room A. Should I send you the building access codes? Actually, that's why I'm calling. Mr. Harrison and I discussed moving the location to somewhere more relaxed. He mentioned the company retreat house in Bellingham, said it might be good for a longer strategic discussion. Vivian's fingers stilled on her keyboard. Blake hadn't mentioned any change of venue to her. In fact, he'd specifically requested the downtown conference room because of its proximity to other afternoon meetings. I'll need to confirm that with Mr. Harrison, she said carefully. Let me call you back within the hour. As she hung up, unease settled in her stomach like a stone. Blake was many things, demanding, arrogant, occasionally cruel, but he was never disorganized. He didn't make last-minute venue changes without consulting his assistant, unless he'd started making decisions without her input entirely. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like another small death, another piece of her professional identity crumbling away. Blake returned from lunch at 2:47, his usual post-meal energy evident in his quick stride. But when he saw Vivian waiting by his office door, something in his expression tightened. Mr. Thorne called about tomorrow's meeting, she said without preamble. He mentioned a venue change to the Bellingham house? Blake stopped walking. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. Then something like embarrassment flickered across his features. Right. Yes. I forgot to mention that to you. The lie sat between them like a physical object. They both knew he hadn't forgotten anything. Blake Harrison's memory was legendary, capable of recalling client preferences from meetings 3 years past. He simply hadn't thought to include her in the decision. I'll arrange the catering and transportation, she said quietly. No need. I'll handle it myself. The words were meant to be dismissive, but they landed like a judgment. After 6 years of handling every detail of his professional life, Blake was suddenly capable of managing logistics on his own. Of course, Vivian replied, her voice carrying no trace of the hurt that was spreading through her chest like spilled ink. Will there be anything else? Blake studied her face as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. Vivian, I have the Morrison report to finish before 5, she interrupted, stepping back toward her desk. If you'll excuse me. She turned away before he could respond, focusing intently on her computer screen until she heard his office door close with a soft click. That evening, as the building emptied and Seattle's lights began to twinkle in the distance, Vivian sat alone at her desk and wondered when she had become so easy to overlook. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years perfecting the art of being indispensable while remaining invisible. Now, it seemed, she had succeeded too well at both. The company retreat house sat like a hidden gem among the evergreens of Bellingham, 2 hours north of Seattle's concrete jungle. Vivian had been here countless times over the years, organizing board retreats, managing executive workshops, coordinating team-building exercises that Blake barely tolerated. The sprawling cedar and glass structure overlooked a pristine lake, complete with a wraparound deck, stone fireplace, and an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the forest beyond. This place never gets old, murmured Harrison Finch, the head of product development, as he hauled his overnight bag from the company van. At 42, Harrison was one of the few executives who treated Vivian like a person, rather than a particularly efficient piece of office equipment. Wait until you see the sunset from the deck, she replied, checking names off her list as the 12-person executive team assembled on the gravel driveway. The weather forecast shows clear skies all weekend. Blake emerged from his black Tesla, phone pressed to his ear, designer sunglasses reflecting the afternoon light. Even in casual khakis and a navy pullover, he managed to look like he was heading to a board meeting rather than a relaxing weekend retreat. No, Henderson. I don't care what the Singapore office thinks about the timeline. Make it work. He ended the call with unnecessary force, shoving the phone into his pocket like it had personally offended him. Vivienne consulted her tablet, mentally running through the weekend's logistics. Dinner at 7, prepared by the local catering company she'd used for 3 years running. Breakfast presentation starting at 9 tomorrow. Team activities Saturday afternoon, followed by the traditional poolside barbecue. Every detail had been planned and confirmed twice. Rooms are assigned and keys are on the kitchen counter, she announced to the group. Dinner's in 90 minutes. The Wi-Fi password is posted by the coffee station for anyone who absolutely can't disconnect. A collective groan rose from the executives, half joking, half genuine. These quarterly retreats were supposed to be about strategic planning and team building, but everyone knew they were really about trying to remember why they worked together in the first place. Blake approached her with that familiar expression of controlled impatience. The Morrison contracts, did you bring the revised versions? They're in the blue folder in your room, along with the Henderson timeline you were just discussing and backup chargers for all your devices. Her tone was perfectly professional, but something in her delivery made him pause. Right. Good. He seemed to want to say something else, but Harrison Finch chose that moment to clap him on the shoulder. Come on, boss. First rule of retreats. No shop talk until after dinner. Let's grab a beer and pretend we're normal human beings for 5 minutes. As the group migrated toward the house, Vivienne lingered on the deck, ostensibly checking her phone but really stealing a moment of solitude. The late afternoon sun painted the lake in shades of gold and amber, while somewhere in the distance, a loon called to its mate with haunting beauty. She had always loved this place, had often imagined what it would be like to stay here not as the coordinator but as a guest, to actually relax, instead of mentally cataloging potential problems and solutions. You're not joining us for drinks? The voice startled her from her thoughts. Blake stood in the doorway, hands shoved in his pockets, looking oddly uncertain. I need to confirm tomorrow's catering delivery and check the presentation equipment, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Standard protocol. Right, of course. But he didn't move. Listen, Vivienne, about the meeting change with Thorne yesterday. I should have communicated that better. The closest thing to an apology she'd ever heard from him. A month ago it might have meant something. Now it felt like too little, too late. It's handled, Mr. Harrison. Everything's under control. The formal address hung between them like a wall. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell she'd learned to read over 6 years of working together. You don't have to call me that here. It's just, we're all supposed to be relaxing, right? Of course. She offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Enjoy your beer, Blake. The use of his first name should have felt like progress, but somehow it sounded even more distant than the formal address had. Blake seemed to sense it too, because his frown deepened. Are you sure everything's... Vivienne? Harrison Finch's voice boomed from inside the house. Come settle a debate about the best hiking trails around here. Janet thinks we should tackle Mount Baker tomorrow, but I say we'd never make it back for the afternoon session. Grateful for the interruption, Vivienne brushed past Blake and headed inside, leaving him standing alone on the deck with questions he couldn't quite formulate. The evening progressed with the usual rhythm of corporate socializing. Dinner was excellent. Cedar plank salmon with local vegetables and a wine selection that loosened tongues and temporarily dissolved the hierarchies that ruled their weekday lives. Vivienne found herself seated between Harrison and Janet Torres, far enough from Blake to avoid awkward conversation, but close enough to observe him throughout the meal. He was charming when he wanted to be. She'd give him that. The same ruthless focus that made him a formidable CEO also made him an engaging dinner companion when the mood struck him. But she noticed something else, too. His gaze kept drifting her way, lingering just a moment too long before he'd catch himself and look away. It was subtle, probably invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read his moods and anticipate his needs. So, what's the verdict on tomorrow's hiking adventure? Asked David Holloway, already on his third glass of wine. Are we conquering mountains or staying civilized? I vote for the lake trail, said Janet. Beautiful views without the risk of anyone needing rescue. Spoken like a true risk management officer, laughed Harrison. But I'm with you. Some of us aren't exactly in mountain climbing shape. The conversation drifted to weekend plans and family stories. Vivienne contributed when asked but mostly listened, filing away personal details the way she always did. Janet's daughter was starting college. Harrison's wife was training for a marathon. David had just bought a vintage motorcycle he was afraid to actually ride. Blake, she noticed, said almost nothing about his personal life. He never did. As the evening wound down and people began drifting toward their rooms, Vivian remained behind to coordinate the next day's breakfast with the catering staff. Standard procedure. She'd done it dozens of times before, but as she stood alone in the kitchen, reviewing tomorrow's schedule on her tablet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend was going to change something fundamental. The question was whether she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the lake had turned to black glass, reflecting the first stars of the evening. Soon everyone would be asleep, and she could stop pretending that everything was exactly as it had always been. The pretending, she was discovering, was becoming the hardest part of all. The world stopped moving at exactly 4:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. Blake had been discussing quarterly projections with two potential investors on the retreat house's wraparound deck, the kind of casual but crucial conversation that happened when business leaders pretended to relax. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the evergreens, and the scent of barbecue smoke drifted from the outdoor kitchen where Harrison was playing chef for the evening's team dinner. "The Northwest expansion numbers are impressive," murmured James Whitfield, a silver-haired venture capitalist whose approval could unlock eight-figure investments. "But I'd like to understand the long-term sustainability metrics before we—" Blake's response died in his throat. She was walking toward the pool. For 6 years, Vivian Mitchell had been a constant in his peripheral vision. Efficient, reliable, professionally invisible in her tailored suits and understated presence. He could describe her work ethic in detail, could recite her organizational methods from memory, could predict her responses to almost any corporate crisis. But he had never seen her like this. Her auburn hair, usually imprisoned in that severe chignon, fell in soft waves past her shoulders, catching the afternoon light like burnished copper. She wore a simple one-piece swimsuit in deep navy, elegant, modest, but unable to hide the graceful lines of a figure he'd never bothered to notice beneath her armor of blazers and conservative blouses. She moved with quiet confidence toward the infinity pool's edge, completely unaware that she had just shattered every assumption Blake had built about the woman who organized his entire professional life. "Blake?" James Whitfield's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The sustainability metrics?" Blake's throat felt like sandpaper. "I'm sorry, what was the question?" But his eyes refused to leave Vivian as she stepped into the water with fluid grace, her movements creating gentle ripples that caught the light like scattered diamonds. She belonged here, he realized with startling clarity, not hurrying through corporate hallways or managing conference room logistics, but existing in this moment of serene beauty. How had he never seen this? How had 6 years of working together taught him nothing about the woman behind the professional facade? "The expansion metrics," repeated Whitfield, following Blake's gaze with growing amusement, "though I can see your attention is elsewhere." Heat crept up Blake's neck. He was 35 years old, the CEO of a major corporation, and he was gawking like a teenager who'd never seen an attractive woman before. "Harrison!" called out Janet Torres from the shallow end of the pool where she was floating on an inflatable chair with a drink in her hand. "This barbecue sauce better be as good as you promised or we're ordering pizza." Harrison Finch looked up from the grill, spatula in hand, and grinned. "Have some faith, Janet. I didn't spend 3 summers working at my uncle's restaurant for nothing." The casual banter should have been background noise, but Blake found himself cataloging every word, every laugh, every interaction that included Vivian. She was smiling, actually smiling, as she chatted with Janet about weekend plans and favorite restaurants. When was the last time he'd seen her smile like that at work? When was the last time he'd given her reason to? "She's lovely," observed Margaret Chen, James Whitfield's business partner, settling into the deck chair beside them. "Is she part of your executive team?" "She's—" Blake started, then stopped. What was Vivian exactly? His assistant? That seemed suddenly inadequate, almost insulting. His right hand? His organizational backbone? The person who made his professional life possible? "She's essential," he said finally, the word carrying more weight than he'd intended. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I can see that. Smart move, keeping the talented ones close." But even as she spoke, Blake realized how wrong that assumption was. He hadn't kept Vivian close, he'd kept her invisible, hidden behind professional boundaries and corporate protocols, reduced to a function rather than recognized as a person. The conversation drifted back to business matters, but Blake's attention remained fractured. He watched Harrison dive into the pool with characteristic enthusiasm, splashing Janet and earning playful protests. He watched David attempt an impressive cannonball that impressed no one but himself, and he watched Vivian laugh at their antics with genuine warmth, her professional mask completely abandoned for the first time in his memory. "You should join them," suggested Margaret, noticing his distraction. All work and no play, as they say. Blake shook his head. I'm not much of a swimmer. A lie. He'd been on his prep school swim team, had a pool at his Bellevue mansion that he used for daily laps. But the truth was more complicated. He wasn't sure he trusted himself to be in that pool, in that proximity to Vivian, without saying or doing something that would shatter what remained of their professional relationship. Come on, Blake, Harrison's voice boomed across the water. The temperature's perfect. Boss is too important for pool games, called David with mock seriousness. Might mess up his hair. The gentle ribbing was familiar, expected. Blake usually deflected such invitations with dry humor and strategic retreats to his phone. But today, something kept him rooted to the deck, unable to look away, as Vivian floated on her back, eyes closed, face tilted toward the dying sunlight. She looked peaceful, content, like she belonged exactly where she was, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Blake Harrison felt like he was standing on the outside of something beautiful, looking in. Actually, said James Whitfield, closing his tablet with decisive finality, I think we've covered enough business for one day. Margaret's right. Life's too short to spend every weekend in meetings. As the investors gathered their things and headed inside to freshen up for dinner, Blake remained on the deck, ostensibly reviewing emails on his phone but really watching the play of light on water, the easy camaraderie of his team, the woman who had somehow become the center of a world he'd never bothered to notice, the woman he was finally beginning to see. But seeing her, he realized with growing unease, was going to change everything. And change, Blake had learned long ago, was the one thing he could never quite control. Something primal and unfamiliar was clawing at Blake's chest, and he didn't like it one bit. Dinner had been torture disguised as team building. He'd sat at the head of the long wooden table on the retreat house's deck, mechanically working through Harrison's admittedly excellent barbecued salmon, while his attention remained laser-focused on the woman seated 4 chairs down and completely out of his reach. Vivian had changed into a soft cream sweater and dark jeans, casual clothes he'd never seen her wear, never imagined her owning. Her hair was still loose, still catching the light from the string of Edison bulbs Harrison had strung between the deck posts. She looked relaxed, approachable, human in a way that made Blake's carefully constructed world feel suddenly unstable. The quarterly numbers from the Portland office are impressive, David was saying, gesturing with his wine glass for emphasis. 15% growth over last quarter, 28% year over year. Blake made appropriate listening noises, but his eyes kept drifting to Vivian as she laughed at something Janet had whispered to her. When was the last time he'd made her laugh? Had he ever? Blake? Harrison's voice cut through his distraction. What do you think about expanding the Portland team? I think... Blake dragged his attention back to the conversation, feeling like he was swimming through fog. I think we should review the infrastructure costs before making any commitments. A safe, non-committal response that bought him time while his brain tried to process whatever was happening to him. He was Blake Harrison. He compartmentalized. He focused. He did not get distracted by employees, no matter how the evening light transformed them into something that made his chest tight and his thoughts scatter. Always the pragmatist, laughed Margaret Chen, who'd been invited to stay for dinner as part of the ongoing investor courtship. That's what I like about working with Tech Vision. No rash decisions, just solid business sense. Blake nodded and took another sip of wine, hoping the alcohol would settle whatever storm was brewing in his nervous system. Instead, it seemed to heighten his awareness of everything around him, the way Vivian tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the musical quality of her laugh, the graceful movement of her hands as she gestured during conversation. Vivian's been telling us about her MBA thesis, said Janet, and Blake's attention snapped to full alert. Something about organizational psychology and workplace dynamics. Sounds fascinating. MBA thesis? Blake felt a stab of something uncomfortably close to shame. 6 years of working together, and he'd never asked about her educational background beyond confirming she had the qualifications for the job. It was just academic research, Vivian said with characteristic modesty. But there was something in her tone, a hint of passion carefully contained. I was interested in how company culture affects individual performance and job satisfaction. Not just academic, Harrison protested. Some of the efficiency improvements you've implemented around here could be case studies themselves. That new project management system you designed cut our coordination time by 30%. Blake blinked. Vivian had designed a project management system. When? And why hadn't he been informed that his assistant, was implementing organizational changes that affected company-wide efficiency? It was a small adjustment, Vivian said, but she was looking at her hands now, not meeting anyone's eyes. Nothing revolutionary. Small adjustment? David laughed. You saved us about 20 hours a week in redundant meetings. I'd call that revolutionary. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Blake remained frozen in place, processing this new information, like a computer struggling with corrupted data. Vivian had an MBA. She'd written academic research about workplace dynamics. She'd independently identified and solved efficiency problems in his company, and he'd reduced her to someone who managed his calendar and fetched his coffee. You're quiet tonight, boss, observed Harrison as the dinner crowd began to thin out. Everything okay? Blake forced what he hoped was a casual smile. Just thinking about tomorrow's presentations. Another lie. He was thinking about the woman who was currently helping Janet clear dinner plates, moving with the same unconscious grace she'd shown in the pool that afternoon. The woman he was realizing he'd never bothered to actually see. As the evening wound down, people drifted toward their rooms or gathered in small groups around the fire pit. Blake lingered on the deck, ostensibly checking emails but really watching Vivian coordinate the cleanup with the same effortless competence she brought to everything else. She worked with quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary fuss. But there was something different about her movements here, less guarded, more natural, as if the professional armor she wore at the office had been temporarily set aside. Need any help? The offer left his mouth before his brain had authorized it. Vivian looked up, clearly surprised. In 6 years of working together, Blake Harrison had never offered to help with cleanup. Hell, he'd never offered to help with anything that wasn't directly related to strategic planning or profit margins. I've got it under control, she said after a moment, but thank you. The politeness felt like a wall, professional, impersonal, designed to maintain distance. It was exactly the tone she'd been using with him for weeks now, and suddenly Blake understood why it bothered him so much. He wanted to ask about her MBA, about the project management system, about why she'd never mentioned either. He wanted to understand how someone could work beside him for 6 years while remaining essentially invisible to him. He wanted to know what she thought about, what she cared about, what made her laugh when she wasn't managing his professional disasters. Instead, he said, "The presentation equipment is set up for tomorrow." Of course. She didn't look at him as she stacked the last of the plates. Everything's ready. The conversation died there, killed by habit and hierarchy and the growing weight of everything Blake didn't know how to say. As Vivian headed inside with the dishes, he remained on the deck, staring out at the lake, and wondering when his perfectly ordered world had started feeling like a prison of his own making. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called to its mate, a haunting sound that seemed to echo the loneliness he'd been carrying without realizing it. He'd built an empire of efficiency and profit, surrounded himself with the best minds in the industry, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But he'd somehow forgotten to build connections that mattered. And the woman who mattered most had been standing right beside him all along, waiting for him to notice she was more than just the sum of her professional functions. The question now was whether it was too late to learn how to see her properly. The monster inside Blake's chest had a name, and it was eating him alive. Sunday morning's presentation session had gone smoothly. Quarterly reviews, strategic planning, the usual corporate choreography that Blake could perform in his sleep. But his focus kept fragmenting every time Vivian moved through the room, refilling coffee cups and managing logistics with her trademark efficiency. She was back in professional mode, hair pulled into a loose ponytail, wearing tailored black slacks and a crisp white blouse that somehow managed to be both conservative and devastating. The brief glimpse of the woman from yesterday's pool seemed like a fever dream, something his imagination had conjured to torment him. "Excellent work on the Denver expansion timeline," he heard himself saying to Janet, though his peripheral vision remained locked on Vivian as she quietly distributed updated handouts to the team. "Let's push the implementation date up by 2 weeks." The words were automatic, his CEO autopilot engaged while his conscious mind wrestled with questions that had kept him awake most of the night. How many times had he spoken to Vivian without really looking at her? How many conversations had they shared that were nothing more than professional transactions? "Blake?" Margaret Chen's voice pulled him back to the conference room reality. "The investor presentation deck. Will we have a chance to review it before Thursday's meeting?" "Vivian has the latest version," he said, turning toward her instinctively. "She's coordinated all the financial projections with accounting." For just a moment, their eyes met across the room. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that he'd acknowledged her contribution publicly, but it vanished so quickly he might have imagined it. The morning session concluded with assignments and action items, the familiar rhythm of corporate machinery grinding forward. As people began gathering their materials and discussing lunch plans, Blake found himself calculating excuses to extend the weekend, to keep this strange new awareness from dissolving back into Seattle's daily grind. "Anyone interested in a hike before we head back?" asked Harrison, stretching dramatically. "The weather's perfect and I saw some amazing trails on the map." "Count me in," said Janet immediately. "I need to walk off all that barbecue from last night." "Me too," added David, "though I reserve the right to complain if it's too steep." Blake watched the casual planning unfold, noting how naturally Vivian was included in the group dynamic here, not as an assistant or coordinator, but as a colleague, an equal. "What about you, Vivian?" Harrison asked. "You mentioned loving the outdoors yesterday." "I'd like that," she said, and Blake caught something in her voice. Genuine enthusiasm, carefully modulated, but unmistakable. "The forest trails around here are beautiful." "Settled then," Harrison declared. "Give us 20 minutes to change into hiking gear and we'll explore some wilderness." As the group dispersed to gather supplies and change clothes, Blake remained behind, ostensibly reviewing notes but really trying to process the growing realization that he knew almost nothing about the woman who'd organized his life for 6 years. She loved the outdoors? When had she mentioned that? And to whom? 25 minutes later, he stood on the retreat house deck watching his team assemble for their hiking adventure. Everyone wore appropriate gear, hiking boots, moisture-wicking shirts, day packs loaded with water and snacks. They looked like a group of friends preparing for a Sunday adventure, not corporate executives extending a business retreat. Vivian emerged from the house last, and Blake's breath caught in his throat. She wore fitted hiking pants and a forest green technical shirt that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes. Her hair was braided back practically, and she moved with the confident ease of someone genuinely comfortable in outdoor settings. She looked radiant, alive, like she belonged anywhere but in a corporate conference room managing his calendar. "You're not joining us?" she asked, noticing him standing apart from the group. The question was polite, professional, but Blake caught something else underneath, the faintest hint of genuine curiosity, as if she actually wanted to know his answer. "I have some calls to make," he said, which was partially true. He always had calls to make. "You all enjoy yourselves." What he didn't say was that he wasn't sure he could handle 2 hours of watching Vivian laugh and chat with his colleagues while he remained locked in his role as their remote, demanding boss. The weekend had already shown him too much about what he'd been missing. "Your loss," said Harrison with typical good humor. "We're going to find some spectacular views." As the hiking group set off down the forest trail, Blake retreated to his room and tried to focus on legitimate work. He had emails to answer, reports to review, decisions to make about the Singapore expansion, normal CEO responsibilities that should have commanded his full attention. Instead, he found himself checking his watch every 15 minutes and wondering what they were talking about out there. Was Vivian sharing stories about her life outside work? Was she laughing at Harrison's terrible jokes? Was she finally relaxing enough to let people see who she really was beneath the professional facade? The questions felt like physical pain. 2 hours later, he heard voices and laughter approaching the house. Against his better judgment, Blake positioned himself on the deck where he could observe their return without appearing to wait for them. They emerged from the tree line in animated conversation, faces flushed from exercise and fresh air. Harrison was gesturing wildly as he recounted some story that had Janet doubled over with laughter. David was taking pictures of everything with his phone, playing tourist in their own backyard, and Vivian was glowing. Her cheeks were pink from the hike, her eyes bright with genuine happiness. She was talking to Harrison about something. Blake couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he could see the animation in her face, the easy way she gestured as she spoke. Harrison said something that made her laugh, really laugh, throwing her head back with unguarded delight. Then, and this was the moment that sent something dark and possessive shooting through Blake's nervous system, Harrison reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was a casual gesture, friendly and innocent, the kind of thing colleagues did for each other on hiking trails when wind and exercise left everyone disheveled. But Blake felt it like a physical blow. The emotion that crashed over him was immediate and irrational and completely unfamiliar. Jealousy, raw and primal. flooding his system like poison. He wanted to stride down there and insert himself between Harrison and Vivian, wanted to claim some right to her attention that he'd never earned and didn't deserve. The intensity of it shocked him. Blake Harrison was controlled, rational, above petty emotional displays. He'd built his entire professional identity around logical decision-making and strategic thinking. But watching another man touch Vivian's hair, seeing her smile at someone else with the warmth she'd never shown him, Blake realized that control was an illusion. 6 years of professional distance had done nothing to prepare him for this moment of recognition. He wanted her, not just her efficiency or her organizational skills or her ability to manage his chaotic schedule. He wanted her, and for the first time in his adult life, Blake Harrison understood that wanting something didn't automatically mean he could have it. The drive back to Seattle should have been a relief, but Blake felt like he was suffocating in his own Tesla. 2 hours of highway stretched between the retreat house and the city. 2 hours of forced solitude that gave him too much time to think about everything that had shifted over the weekend. The other executives had carpooled in the company van, their laughter and conversation drifting through his partially open window during the brief moments when traffic forced them to drive side by side. Vivian was in that van, probably still glowing from the hike, still animated by whatever connection she'd found with his colleagues, connections that had somehow eluded her relationship with him for 6 years. By the time Blake reached his Bellevue mansion, the jealousy had crystallized into something more dangerous: determination. He'd spent 35 years getting what he wanted through focus, strategy, and relentless pursuit. Vivian Mitchell would not be the exception. Monday morning arrived with Seattle's typical gray drizzle, as if the weekend sunshine had been a temporary aberration. Blake reached the office at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual, and found Vivian already at her desk with coffee steaming beside her keyboard. She looked up as he approached, and for a split second, he caught something unguarded in her expression. A flicker of the woman from the pool from the hiking trail. Then the professional mask slid back into place like armor. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. The Morrison contracts are on your desk and the Singapore team confirmed the video conference for 3 o'clock. The formal address hit him like a slap. They were back to Mr. Harrison. Back to the careful distance she'd been maintaining since that conference room incident 3 weeks ago. Vivian. He stopped beside her desk, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume. Something subtle and warm that he'd never noticed before. "Do you have a minute to discuss the quarterly reports?" She blinked, clearly surprised by the request. In 6 years of working together, Blake had never asked to discuss routine reports. He received them, reviewed them, and provided feedback via email or brief directives. "Of course," she said, reaching for her tablet. "Should I bring the financial summaries to your office?" "Actually, I thought we could talk over coffee. There's a place downstairs, Cornerstone Cafe. Have you been there?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Vivian's fingers stilled on her tablet, and Blake could practically see her processing the unprecedented nature of his suggestion. Blake Harrison didn't do coffee meetings with his assistant. He didn't do casual conversations about quarterly reports. Yes, I've been there," she said carefully. "But wouldn't it be more efficient to review the reports here? I have the detailed breakdowns on my system." Efficiency. Of course she would default to efficiency. It was the language they'd always spoken together, the only currency their relationship had ever recognized. "Sometimes a change of scenery helps with strategic thinking," Blake said, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced corporate smoothness. 15 minutes, my treat." He turned toward the elevator before she could object, leaving her no choice but to gather her materials and follow. The silence during their descent to the lobby felt charged with questions neither of them knew how to ask. Cornerstone Cafe occupied a corner of TechVision's ground floor, all exposed brick and industrial lighting designed to make corporate drones feel like they were visiting a hip urban coffee shop. Blake had walked past it thousands of times without ever stepping inside. "What can I get you?" he asked as they approached the counter, realizing he had no idea what Vivian drank besides the office coffee that came from the break room machine. "Just a cappuccino," she said. "Thank you." Blake ordered for both of them, hyper-aware of the casual intimacy of the moment. When was the last time he'd bought coffee for someone who wasn't a client or investor? When was the last time he'd paid attention to anyone's preferences beyond what they could do for his bottom line? They found a corner table near the windows, where morning light filtered through Seattle's perpetual cloud cover. Vivian opened her tablet with practiced efficiency, but Blake found himself studying her profile instead of the quarterly summaries. The Northwest Division exceeded projections by 12%. she began, her voice carrying that familiar note of professional competence. The Portland expansion is showing particularly strong. Vivian. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, too intimate for the sterile space they usually occupied. Can we just talk for a minute? Without the reports? She looked up, and for the first time in weeks, really looked at him. Her amber eyes were wary, guarded, but there was something else there too. Curiosity, maybe, or the faintest hint of the warmth he'd glimpsed over the weekend. Talk about what, Mr. Harrison? The formal address again. It was becoming a weapon, a reminder of the distance he'd insisted on maintaining for 6 years. Blake, he said quietly, just Blake, and I wanted to talk about this weekend, about what I saw. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise followed quickly by a flash of vulnerability she tried to hide behind her coffee cup. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean you, Blake said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. I mean the woman who designed a project management system that saved the company 20 hours a week. I mean the MBA who wrote about workplace dynamics while I was reducing her to calendar management. I mean the person who's been standing right beside me for 6 years while I was too blind to actually see her. Vivian set down her cappuccino with carefully controlled movements, but Blake caught the slight tremor in her hands. I don't know what you want me to say to that. I want you to tell me why you never mentioned your MBA, why you never told me about the organizational improvements you were implementing, why you let me treat you like... He trailed off, the full weight of his neglect settling on his shoulders like lead. Like what? Her voice was very quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Like an assistant? Because that's what I am, Blake. That's what you hired me to be. The use of his first name should have felt like progress, but it sounded like an accusation. You're more than that, he said, leaning forward across the small table. You've always been more than that. I was just too what? The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended, and Blake saw 6 years of careful professionalism beginning to crack. Too important? Too busy? Too focused on the bottom line to notice that your assistant had thoughts and ideas and capabilities beyond fetching your coffee? The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Blake felt his chest tighten, as every assumption he'd made about their relationship crumbled under the weight of her quiet fury. Vivian, you what? She was looking directly at him now. Really looking, and Blake realized this might be the first completely honest conversation they'd ever had. You're sorry? You didn't mean to treat me like furniture for 6 years? You somehow forgot that I have a master's degree and a functioning brain? Yes, he said simply. All of that. I'm sorry for all of that. The apology hung between them like a bridge he wasn't sure she'd be willing to cross. For a long moment, Vivian just stared at him, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time too. Why now? She asked finally. Why this conversation now? Because I saw you in that pool and realized I've been an idiot, Blake thought. Because watching Harrison touch your hair made me want to commit actual violence. Because I've spent 3 days understanding that I don't just need you professionally. I want you in ways that terrify me. But he couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Not when she was looking at him like he was a problem she was trying to solve. Because I think I'm finally ready to see you, he said instead. The real you. If you'll let me. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that 6 years of professional distance had carved. Vivienne stared at Blake across the small cafe table, her cappuccino growing cold as she processed words she'd never expected to hear from him. I think I'm finally ready to see you. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like a question she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The real me, she repeated slowly, and Blake caught something dangerous in her tone. The edge of someone who'd spent years being careful and was suddenly tired of it. I'm not sure you'd recognize her, Blake. I'm not sure she fits into your perfectly organized world. There was pain in her voice. Layers of it built up over years of being reduced to function rather than seen as person. Blake felt each word like a physical blow, understanding for the first time the true cost of his blindness. Try me, he said quietly. Vivian laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to know who I really am? I'm the woman who redesigned your entire filing system because I was bored out of my mind organizing the same meaningless reports over and over. I'm the person who wrote 3 different proposals for improving interdepartmental communication and never submitted them because I knew you'd dismiss them as overstepping. She was leaning forward now, 6 years of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. I'm someone who has a master's degree in organizational psychology and spends her days scheduling your lunch meetings with people who have half my qualifications. I'm the woman who knows more about Tech Vision's operational inefficiencies than anyone in that building, including you, because I'm the one who has to clean up the mess when your executive decisions crash into reality. Blake felt like he was drowning. Every word she spoke revealed another layer of his failure, another way he'd wasted the resource. No, the person, who'd been right beside him all along. Vivian, I'm not finished. Her amber eyes were blazing now, and Blake realized this might be the first time in 6 years she'd interrupted him. You want to see the real me? I'm the woman who goes home every night to an apartment I love, where I paint watercolors and read philosophy and cook elaborate meals for one because I'm too exhausted from being professionally invisible to maintain a social life. The image hit him like a punch to the gut. Vivian, alone in her apartment, creating beauty and meaning in the spaces he'd never bothered to imagine existed. I'm someone who used to love her job, she continued, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, who believed she was building something important with a company she respected, until she realized that to the person she worked closest with, she was just furniture with a paycheck. The words landed like a death sentence. Blake had heard harsh truths in boardrooms, had weathered brutal negotiations and hostile takeovers, but nothing had ever cut as deep as Vivian's quiet devastation. He started, then stopped, because he had. He absolutely had treated her exactly like furniture with a paycheck, and they both knew it. You never what? She asked, and there was something almost gentle in her tone now, as if his obvious pain had softened her anger into something more complex. You never meant to? You never realized? You never thought about it? Blake struggled to find words that could bridge the canyon of neglect he'd created. I never understood what I was doing to you. I never understood what I was missing. And what were you missing, Blake? The question was a test, a final chance for him to prove he was capable of seeing beyond his own corporate tunnel vision. Blake looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the woman who managed his calendar, but the person who'd been holding his professional life together, while he remained oblivious to her intelligence, her creativity, her worth as a human being. Everything, he said simply. I was missing everything that mattered. Something shifted in Vivian's expression, a crack in the armor she'd built around her anger. That's not an answer, Blake. That's an evasion. She was right, and they both knew it. Blake took a breath and forced himself to be as honest as she'd been, to match her courage with his own vulnerability. I was missing the fact that you're brilliant, that you see solutions I can't see, understand problems I don't even recognize. I was missing that you're creative and thoughtful, and he paused, struggling with words that felt too intimate for their fragile professional relationship, and beautiful. Not just physically, though God knows I was blind to that too, but beautiful in the way you think, the way you approach problems, the way you care about doing things right even when no one notices. Vivian's breath caught almost imperceptibly, and Blake saw her walls waver for the first time. I was missing, he continued, his voice gaining strength, that you're exactly the kind of person I should have been learning from instead of just giving orders to. I was missing that working with you should have been a partnership, not a power dynamic. He leaned back in his chair, feeling drained by the confession but also somehow lighter. And I was missing that somewhere along the way. Without realizing it, you became important to me, not just professionally, personally, in ways I'm still trying to understand. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure how to cross. Vivian stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Surprise, wariness, something that might have been hope. Blake, she said finally, and her voice was softer now, more uncertain. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what this conversation is supposed to accomplish. I want a chance, he said simply. A chance to start over, to build something better than what we had, to prove that I can see you now, really see you, and value what I see. And what if it's too late? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 6 years of accumulated hurt. What if I've already decided that being invisible is easier than being disappointed again? Blake felt his chest tighten with something that might have been panic. The possibility that he'd lost her before he'd even realized she was worth keeping felt like a kind of death. Then I'll wait, he said, surprised by his own certainty. However long it takes. I'll wait and I'll prove that I'm worth the risk of becoming visible again. Vivian studied his face as if she were trying to solve a complex equation. When she finally spoke, her words were careful, measured, but not unkind. I need time, Blake. Time to figure out if this is real, or if it's just guilt making you temporarily noble. Time to decide if I'm brave enough to trust you with the parts of myself I've kept hidden. Blake nodded, understanding that this was the best he could hope for. Not forgiveness, but the possibility of it. Not trust, but the chance to earn it. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. 3 weeks had passed since the coffee shop confession, and Blake was learning that patience was the cruelest form of hope. He'd kept his word about giving Vivian space, but the effort was slowly killing him. Their professional interactions had returned to a careful neutrality, polite, efficient, but lacking the warmth he'd glimpsed during their confrontation. She answered his questions, managed his schedule, coordinated meetings with the same flawless competence she'd always shown, but she remained unreachable, protected behind walls that seemed higher than ever. Blake found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, the small smile that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking at particularly good quarterly numbers, the precise way she organized everything around her, creating order from the chaos of corporate life. He'd started bringing her coffee from Cornerstone Cafe each morning, not the break room swill she'd been surviving on for 6 years, but real cappuccinos with the perfect foam art that she studied with quiet appreciation before drinking. She always thanked him politely, but there was distance in her gratitude, as if she was waiting for him to reveal the ulterior motive behind the gesture. The problem was, Blake wasn't entirely sure what his motive was, beyond the growing certainty that he'd rather spend his energy earning Vivian's trust than pursuing any other goal in his life. "You're distracted," observed Margaret Chen during Thursday's investor lunch, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Blake mechanically worked through his salmon, while his attention drifted toward TechVision's 32nd floor. "Focused," Blake corrected, though they both knew it was a lie. "The Singapore expansion is requiring more strategic attention than anticipated." Margaret smiled with the knowing expression of someone who'd spent decades reading people for a living. "And here I thought it might be about the lovely assistant from the retreat. Vivian, wasn't it?" Blake's fork stilled halfway to his mouth. "Vivian is an executive coordinator, not an assistant, and she's brilliant at her job." "Ah." Margaret's smile widened. "Executive coordinator. My mistake, though I notice you didn't deny the distraction part." Before Blake could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Emergency at the office. Need you back ASAP." 20 minutes later, Blake burst through TechVision's lobby doors to find controlled chaos on the 32nd floor. Half his executive team was clustered around Vivian's desk, voices raised in what sounded like barely contained panic. "What's the situation?" Blake asked, sliding automatically into crisis management mode. "System crash," Harrison explained tersely. "The entire client database went down about an hour ago. We're locked out of everything: contracts, contact information, project timelines. IT says it could take days to restore from backups." Blake felt his stomach drop. TechVision's client database contained 6 years of carefully cultivated relationships, millions of dollars in pending contracts, and operational details that would be nearly impossible to reconstruct from memory. "How much can we recover?" he asked, though he was already calculating the devastating impact on next quarter's projections. "That's just it," said Janet, her usual composure cracking around the edges. "Backups failed. The entire system went down simultaneously. Primary servers, backup drives, cloud storage. IT is calling it a perfect storm of technical failures." Blake felt the blood drain from his face. A complete database loss could cripple TechVision for months, maybe permanently. 6 years of growth reduced to digital ash. "Actually," Vivian's voice cut through the rising panic like a lifeline, "we might not be as lost as we think." Every head turned toward her, and Blake saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken with hope rather than fear. "I've been maintaining parallel records," she continued, moving to her computer with characteristic efficiency. "Not officially, just personal backup files for my own organizational purposes. Client contact information, project timelines, contract status updates. I update them weekly." The silence that followed was absolute. Blake stared at her, processing the impossible salvation she was offering. "You have our entire client database?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the full technical specifications," Vivian clarified, pulling up files with practiced keystrokes. "But names, contact information, project status, renewal dates, key personnel, everything we need to maintain operations while IT rebuilds the technical infrastructure." Blake watched her work, saw the methodical way she'd cataloged information, that no one had asked her to track, created redundancies that no one had thought to implement. She'd essentially built a shadow database, not because it was her job, but because she'd seen a potential vulnerability and quietly addressed it. "This is," Harrison started, then shook his head in amazement. "This is going to save the company." "How long have you been maintaining these records?" Blake asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "About 4 years," Vivian replied without looking up from her screen. "Ever since that smaller crash in 2021, I realized how dependent we were on a single system and decided to create some insurance. 4 years of unpaid, unacknowledged work. 4 years of protecting a company that had barely recognized her contributions." Blake felt something crack open in his chest. Not jealousy this time, but pure admiration mixed with shame so acute it was hard to breathe. "Vivian," he said quietly, aware that the entire executive team was listening but not caring. "You just saved Tech Vision Corp." She finally looked up from her computer, meeting his eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I was just doing my job." "No," Blake said firmly. "You were doing everyone's job, including mine." The compliment seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, and Blake caught a glimpse of the woman from the coffee shop, vulnerable, uncertain, but undeniably brilliant. "I'll need about 6 hours to format everything for the IT team," she said, her voice back to businesslike efficiency. "We can have basic operations restored by tomorrow morning." As the crisis team dispersed to coordinate damage control and client communication, Blake remained beside Vivian's desk, watching her work with the focused intensity that had probably saved his company. "Why?" he asked when they were finally alone. "Why what? Why did you create those backup files? Why did you spend 4 years protecting a company that—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "That treated me like furniture?" Vivian supplied, her tone surprisingly gentle. "Because it wasn't just your company, Blake. I worked here too. My livelihood depended on Tech Vision's success just as much as yours did." The pragmatic answer should have satisfied him, but Blake sensed there was more to it. "And?" Vivian's fingers paused on her keyboard. When she looked at him, he saw something raw and honest in her expression. "And because I believe in what we're building here, even when you couldn't see my contributions, even when I felt invisible, I still believed in the work. I still believed it mattered." The words hit Blake like a revelation. While he'd been focused on profit margins and market share, Vivian had been quietly protecting the foundation that made everything else possible. She'd had faith in Tech Vision even when Tech Vision had failed to have faith in her. "Vivian," he said, his voice rough with emotions he was still learning to name. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know. What you did today, what you've been doing for years without recognition, it matters. You matter. Not just to the company, but to me." She studied his face with the careful attention she brought to everything important, searching for something he hoped she would find. "Blake," she said finally, and there was something different in her voice. Softer, more uncertain. I think I might be ready to believe that." The corporate gala was supposed to be a celebration, but Blake felt like he was walking to his execution. Tech Vision's annual investor dinner filled the ballroom of Seattle's Grand Metropolitan Hotel, with the usual cast of venture capitalists, board members, and industry leaders. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos, while a jazz quartet provided elegant background music for conversations that would shape millions of dollars in funding decisions. Blake should have been in his element, networking, strategizing, cementing the relationships that kept Tech Vision at the forefront of the tech industry. Instead, he found himself scanning the crowd for the one person whose presence would make the evening bearable. Vivian had arrived 20 minutes ago, and Blake's breath had literally caught in his throat when he saw her. Gone was the conservative professional attire that had defined their 6-year working relationship. In its place, she wore a midnight blue dress that skimmed her figure with elegant sophistication, her auburn hair styled in soft waves that caught the light with every movement. She looked radiant, confident, like she belonged in this world of power and influence, not as an assistant managing logistics, but as an equal participant in the conversations that mattered. "Blake!" Margaret Chen appeared at his elbow, resplendent in emerald green silk. "Wonderful turnout tonight. Though I have to say I'm impressed by your recent organizational changes." "Changes?" Blake dragged his attention away from Vivian, who was currently engaged in animated conversation with 3 board members. "Your executive coordinator," Margaret clarified with a knowing smile. "Vivian, wasn't it?" I heard about the database crisis last month. Quite the save she pulled off. James Whitfield's been telling everyone who will listen that TechVision has the most competent operational management in the industry. Blake felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with TechVision's reputation and everything to do with watching Vivian finally receive the recognition she'd always deserved. "She's remarkable," he said, the words carrying more weight than Margaret could possibly understand. "She certainly is. In fact, I believe Harrison Finch has been trying to poach her for his new startup. Something about offering her a director position." The information hit Blake like ice water. Harrison was trying to hire Vivian away from TechVision. The thought of losing her, not just professionally but before he'd had a chance to prove he could see her properly, sent something close to panic shooting through his nervous system. "Excuse me," he murmured to Margaret, already moving toward the cluster of people surrounding Vivian. As he approached, he caught fragments of conversation that made his chest tighten with emotions he was still learning to name. "The organizational psychology principles are fascinating," Vivian was saying to Dr. Amanda Westbrook, the CEO of a major consulting firm. "Most companies focus on structural efficiency without considering the human dynamics that actually drive productivity." "Exactly." Dr. Westbrook leaned forward with obvious interest. "I'd love to discuss your theories on workplace motivation sometime. Perhaps over lunch next week." Blake watched Vivian bloom under the attention, saw her engage with these industry leaders as the intellectual equal she'd always been. The contrast with their previous dynamic, where he'd barely acknowledged her contributions, felt like a physical blow. "Blake!" Harrison Finch materialized beside him, champagne glass in hand, and something that looked like guilt flickering across his expression. "Great party. Though I should probably mention, I made Vivian an offer she might not be able to refuse." "So I heard." Blake's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Director of Operations? Director of Strategic Development, actually. 50% raise, full benefits, and the chance to build something from the ground up." Harrison's expression grew more serious. "Look, I know she's been essential to TechVision, but the woman has been criminally underutilized. She's got more operational insight than half the executives I know." Blake knew Harrison was right, which made the conversation infinitely more painful. "What did she say?" "She asked for time to consider it." "But Blake," Harrison paused, studying his friend's expression with growing understanding. "This isn't just about business for you, is it?" Before Blake could answer, the evening's program began. He found himself seated at the head table, ostensibly to deliver the keynote address about TechVision's future, but really just trying to process the possibility that Vivian might disappear from his life entirely. His speech was scheduled for 9 o'clock, the usual corporate theater of vision statements and growth projections that investors expected to hear. Blake had given hundreds of similar presentations, could deliver inspiring rhetoric about market expansion and technological innovation in his sleep. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, his prepared remarks suddenly felt hollow, inadequate for the moment that was crystallizing in his mind. At 9:03 p.m., Blake Harrison stepped up to the podium and made the most important decision of his professional life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "I had planned to talk to you tonight about TechVision's projected market growth and our expansion into Southeast Asian markets." He paused, his eyes finding Vivian's across the crowded room. She was watching him with curious attention, probably wondering why he was deviating from the script she'd helped him prepare. "But instead, I want to talk about recognition, about the difference between seeing and truly seeing, about the cost of professional blindness and the value of admitting when you've been wrong." A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. This wasn't the kind of speech investors expected at corporate galas. 6 years ago, TechVision hired an executive coordinator named Vivian Mitchell. Blake's voice grew stronger as he committed fully to the path he was choosing. "For 6 years, she's managed every detail of this company's daily operations with a level of competence and insight that I took for granted. For 6 years, she's been the operational backbone that made every success story you've heard tonight possible." He could see Vivian's eyes widen with shock and something that might have been alarm. Public recognition had never been part of their dynamic, had never been something she'd sought or expected. Last month, when a complete system failure threatened to destroy TechVision's client database, it was Vivian's foresight and preparation that saved the company, not because it was her assigned responsibility, but because she'd spent 4 years quietly protecting an organization that had never thought to protect her. The ballroom had gone completely quiet. Blake could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, but his attention remained locked on Vivian's face. "But tonight isn't just about professional recognition," he continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate despite the public forum. "Tonight is about admitting that I spent 6 years working beside the most remarkable person I've ever met, while being too blind to see her value, too focused on profit margins to notice brilliance, too caught up in hierarchy to recognize partnership." Vivian's hand had moved to her throat, and Blake could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing even from across the room. Vivian Mitchell has a master's degree in organizational psychology. She's designed systems that have saved TechVision hundreds of hours in operational efficiency. She's identified problems I couldn't see and implemented solutions I never thought to consider. She's brilliant, insightful, creative, and— Blake paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "And I've been in love with her intelligence, her integrity, and her strength for longer than I had the courage to admit." The confession hung in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like a bridge he'd finally found the courage to build. The ballroom remained silent, but Blake's world had narrowed to the woman whose expression was cycling through shock, vulnerability, and something that might have been hope. "So tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "instead of talking about market projections, I want to say what should have been said years ago. Vivian Mitchell, you are seen. You are valued. You are essential not just to TechVision's success but to my understanding of what success actually means." He stepped back from the podium, his heart hammering against his ribs as the implications of his public declaration settled over him. He'd just confessed his feelings to a roomful of investors and industry leaders. He'd just made their private struggle into public theater. But as he watched Vivian rise from her seat and move toward him with purpose in every step, Blake realized he didn't care about the professional consequences. He cared about the woman who was finally walking toward him instead of away. 2 years later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of TechVision's executive conference room, casting golden light across the polished oak table where the quarterly review meeting was about to begin. Vivian Mitchell Harrison adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal blazer and reviewed her presentation notes one final time. As Director of Strategic Operations, she'd spent the past month analyzing market trends and organizational efficiency metrics that would shape TechVision's next fiscal year. The data was compelling, the recommendations sound, and she felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge that had drawn her to this work in the first place. "Ready for this?" Blake asked quietly, settling into the chair beside her, not at the head of the table where he'd once held court, but as her partner in the collaborative leadership structure they'd built together. "Always," she replied with a smile that reached her eyes, the kind of smile she'd once reserved for moments when she thought no one was watching. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The evening of the gala confession had been followed by months of careful reconstruction, professional boundaries redefined, personal trust rebuilt brick by brick, and a partnership forged from honesty rather than hierarchy. Blake had insisted on promoting her immediately after that night, despite the scandal his public declaration had caused among Seattle's business community. Harrison Finch's job offer had become unnecessary. TechVision had finally learned to value what it already possessed. "The Northwest expansion numbers look strong," observed Janet Torres as the executive team assembled. Vivian's market analysis was spot on about the consumer electronics demand surge. "The projections were conservative," Vivian replied with characteristic precision. "We actually exceeded targets by 18%, thanks to Blake's insight about early holiday marketing campaigns. The easy exchange of credit, the collaborative reference to each other's contributions. These were the small victories that marked how far they'd traveled from the days when her ideas had been invisible and his leadership had been isolating." Margaret Chen, now a full board member and frequent collaborator, leaned back in her chair with obvious satisfaction. "I have to say, this partnership approach has been remarkable to watch. TechVision's operational efficiency has improved by 35% since the leadership restructure." Blake and Vivian exchanged a glance that contained volumes of shared understanding. The restructure had been his idea, a formal recognition that the company worked best when her strategic mind balanced his visionary impulses. Equal partners, equal decision-makers, equal stakeholders in success and failure alike. "Speaking of partnerships," Harrison interjected with barely contained glee, "I believe congratulations are in order for our power couple here." Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks as Blake's hand found hers beneath the table, a small gesture of solidarity that had become their signature comfort. 6 months ago, Blake had proposed not with champagne and roses, but with a detailed business plan for how they could build a life together, without compromising the professional respect they'd fought so hard to establish. The engagement party is next weekend, Blake confirmed, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned that the best victories were shared ones, though we're keeping it small, just family and close colleagues. Including my watercolor paintings as centerpieces, Vivian added with mock seriousness. Blake finally got to see my apartment. The laughter that filled the conference room was warm, inclusive, the sound of people who genuinely enjoyed working together. It was everything their old dynamic had lacked: humor, equality, mutual recognition of each other's humanity. As the meeting transitioned into quarterly presentations, Vivian found herself observing the easy rhythm she and Blake had developed. He presented the vision. She provided the operational framework. He dreamed big. She built the systems to make dreams reality. He challenged assumptions. She tested theories against practical constraints. They'd become what they should have been from the beginning: true partners, complementary strengths creating something stronger than either could achieve alone. One more item before we adjourn, Blake said as the formal agenda concluded. I wanted to share some news about TechVision's expansion into educational technology. Vivian straightened, recognizing the particular tone in his voice that meant he was about to spring something he'd been planning in secret. We've been invited to consult with Seattle Public Schools on implementing organizational psychology principles in classroom management, he continued, his eyes finding hers across the table. It's a pilot program that could revolutionize how educational institutions approach student engagement and learning outcomes. The words hit Vivian like a lightning bolt of possibility. Educational applications of organizational psychology had been the focus of her MBA thesis, the work she'd done in graduate school, and never imagined she'd have the opportunity to implement. Blake, she said slowly, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that TechVision's new Educational Innovation Division could use a director who understands both the theoretical framework and the practical implementation challenges, he replied with the expression of someone offering the perfect gift. Someone with a master's degree in organizational psychology and 6 years of experience turning academic theories into business solutions. The offer hung in the air like a promise, like recognition not just of who she was now but of who she'd always been capable of becoming. Vivian felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness or frustration, but from the overwhelming recognition that she was finally, truly seen. I think, she said carefully, that sounds like exactly the kind of challenge I've been waiting for. Later that evening, as Seattle's skyline glittered beyond the windows of Blake's Bellevue home, their home now, Vivian stood at the kitchen island preparing dinner while Blake reviewed contracts at the breakfast bar. It was a scene of domestic contentment that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, when their entire relationship existed within the sterile boundaries of professional necessity. Penny for your thoughts, Blake said, looking up from his paperwork to study her expression. Just thinking about how different everything is, she replied, stirring the sauce that would accompany the salmon they'd selected together at Pike Place Market that morning. 2 years ago, I was invisible. Now I'm planning our engagement party and designing educational programs that could impact thousands of students. Blake closed his laptop and moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist in a gesture that still felt miraculous in its simple intimacy. 2 years ago I was successful but empty, he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. I had everything I thought I wanted, and nothing that actually mattered. Vivian leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid comfort of being known, being valued, being loved for exactly who she was rather than what she could provide. You know what the best part is? She asked, turning in his arms to face him. Tell me. We both got exactly what we needed. You learned to see beyond profit margins and power dynamics. I learned to believe I was worth being seen. Blake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones with reverent attention. You were always worth being seen, Vivian. I was just too blind to realize what I was looking at. As he kissed her, soft, sure, full of promise, Vivian thought about the journey that had brought them here. From invisible assistant to equal partner, from professional distance to intimate partnership, from corporate hierarchy to collaborative love. Sometimes she reflected as Blake deepened the kiss, and the sauce simmered forgotten on the stove. The most profound transformations began with the simplest recognition. that the person standing right beside you might be exactly what you've been searching for all along. You just have to be brave enough to truly see them, and wise enough to let yourself be seen in return. The end. Your participation in our channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. What would you do if someone you'd worked with for years suddenly saw you in a completely new light? Have you ever had to rebuild a relationship from the ground up after realizing you'd been blind to someone's true worth? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.